Stefano Visentin, who is the professor of the history of political doctrines at the University of Urbino Carlo Bo. He has published on Spinoza's political philosophy, Dutch and European republicanism in early modernity, and his most recent book is on Spinoza's democracy, La Libertà Necessaria. And so without any further ado, I introduce him as our speaker.
Thank you Warren. And sì, anch'io ringrazio molto gli organizzatori per questo bellissimo convegno, mi sento di ringraziare anche il personale e tutti quanti quelli che hanno collaborato alla riuscita, e con una captatio benevolenza ringrazio anche i relatori che mi hanno preceduto, perché ho imparato moltissime cose, devo dire. I would like to start with two preliminary remarks. One is rather ironical. I say that I should change the subtitle of my intervention after Etienne's speech. It's again, or once more, on Machiavelli's political topography. As a partial justification of this repetition, I will try to make use of this reference to topographic thought in Machiavelli independently from Althusser's use. And another remarks, more seriously, regards the fact that I will maintain in my speech the word popolo in Italian, except when I'm quoting from English translations, in order to avoid the risk of, since I cannot really deal with the ambivalence between the plural and singular meaning of the English word people, so I prefer to stay on popolo to simplify my speech. So, what I would try to do is to draw out from some different uses, meaning of the term popolo in Machiavellian works, certainly not all the uses, but hopefully some relevance, just to draw out some theoretical aspects which, in my opinion, haunted and somehow keep haunting modern political thought. In particular, any political theory meant to deal with the idea of state as a unitary political form. We'll try to demonstrate that a very relevant part of Machiavelli's work is focused on the strategies by which il popolo reveals himself within a specific historical frame, determined by the conjuncture, and by doing this he contributes to the construction and reconstruction of a new political order, although always unstable. Initially, we'll take into account the prince and the discourses, while in conclusion I will make some references to the history of Florence, whose analysis would allow me to problematize the outcomes of the first part of my paper. Several scholars already noted that Machiavellian discussion on the nature of il popolo is eminently a political issue. As Fabio Frosini recently wrote, the popolo occupies a space which is structurally disputable, homogeneous and common. In other words, we could say il popolo owns an identity only insofar as he makes himself visible on the political scene. In strict analogy with the new prince, also, il popolo is what he appears to be. So Gabriele Podula wrote that does not exist a popolo in an abstract sense. We could say also that there is nothing like an idea of popolo, or popolo like an ideal in Machiavelli's thought. To become visible means to have the possibility of occupying a political space, thus producing some effects which can influence other political actors, but also the possibility to be influenced and modified by them. The emergence of il popolo can essentially happen in different ways and by means of different figures or faces, depending, as I told you before, on the historical and political conjunctures. The first figure I will take into account is the figure of the popolo as plebe. Such a figure, as is well known, is introduced by Machiavelli within his doctrine of humors, which is presented both in the Prince and in the discourses, and in the history of Florence too, although in a different way. Well, I'm not quoting the famous sentences of the Prince chapter 9 and of discourses 1-4. Just only underline that in these sentences, Machiavelli overthrows the medieval and humanistic principle of concord, contained in the famous Sallustian maxim that concordia parvae res crescunt, discordia maximae dilabuntur, With concord, small things increase. With discord, the greatest things go to ruin. And this is exemplified by the historical genesis in Rome of the tribunes of the plebs, which are the institutional results of popular tumults, in order to contrast, I'm quoting, the ambition of the nobility, which would in that case have corrupted the Republic long before they did. Molto tempo innanzi, corrotta quella Repubblica che non la si corroppe. This is from Discourses, 3rd book, chapter 11. Here, the popolo shows up within the context of a struggle against another part of the Republic, but his position is not symmetrical with the position of the nobles, of the greats, because the popular desire to be neither commanded nor oppressed is potentially universal, since it can be expanded, at least theoretically, to all citizens, while, on the contrary, the aristocratic desire to command and oppress is always hierarchical and exclusive, as it continuously needs to maintain the inequality among the parts of the city. That is the reason why the aristocratic governments tend to become oligarchies, that is, government by the few. In other words, the humor of the nobles causes the corruption of common good, whereas the humor of the popolo reinforces everyone's freedom. Therefore, the desires of the popolo are, I'm quoting from Discourses, book 1st, chapter 4, very seldom harmful to liberty. The popolo, fighting against nobility, plays the role of a part of the city against another part. Nevertheless, by doing so, he protects the space of freedom of everyone, since, as Machiavelli writes in Discourses, 1st book, chapter 5, he, quoting, will keen on liberty since his hope of usurping dominion over others will be less than in the case of the upper class. So that, if the populace, populari, be made guardians of liberty, it is reasonable, ragionevole, to suppose that they will take more care of it, and that, since it is impossible for them to usurp power, I think it's better the Republic, they will not permit others to do so. End of quote. The reason why the popolo fights for freedom derives from the position he occupies within the space of the city, that is, a position of subalternity, subordination, and from his attempt to get rid of it, an attempt which can never reach an absolute dominion, and thus must be content to limit the aristocracy's power. This is why the tribunes of the plebs can also be defined as, I'm quoting a colleague of mine, Fabio Raimondi, institutions of non-dominion. So, by passing from the invisibility to the visibility, the popolo, on the one side, upsets the presumed naturalness of the previous order and the relationship of domination supporting it. On the other side, he forces other political actors to modify their behaviors by the confrontation with his active presence. In fact, the emergence of the popolo does not create an absolute disorder, and this is why Machiavelli says that the Roman Republic was neither divided nor disordered, but on the contrary, it establishes a new political order which takes its strength from the division, although such division must be regulated by means of the laws. It's a quote, I'm quoting from first book, chapter 7 of Discourses. Nothing does so much to stabilize and strengthen stabile e ferma a republic as some institutions whereby the changeable humors, l'alterazione degli umori, which agitate it, are afforded a proper outlet by way of the laws. Hanno una via di sfogarsi per via delle leggi. End of quotation. As a consequence, the law are both the outcome of tumults, since they originate from the struggle between the humors, and the instruments to turn this fight into drive to freedom, since they avoid the risk that the partiality becomes sectarianism. In any case, tumults can never be completely neutralized, not even by a perfect or mixed constitution, as they always emerge again and again, and must be uninterruptedly afforded by him or them who takes care of the republic. In Machiavelli's view, the division within the political body is a constituent element, and neither just laws nor virtuous government can compose them once for all. Laws can introduce a truce, we could say, in the city. They cannot eliminate the conflict between the popolo and the nobility, even because, as we shall see in the history of Florence, the complete defeat of one part causes immediately the creation of a new division within the victorious part. The desires of the popolo needs to be contained within precise limits, since, I'm quoting from Discourses, first book, chapter 46, men seek first to be free from apprehension, di non temere, then make other apprehensive, as if it were necessary either to treat other ills or to be ill-treated, offendere o essere offeso. Therefore, it seems that the famous Tacitian maxim that the popolo, if he does not fear himself, he makes others afraid, terrere ni paveant, seems to be accepted also by the Florentine. But to be sure of such a conclusion, we must go to consider a second phase or figure of the people. The second phase is the people as multitude. Such a figure appears in the last chapters of the first book of the Discourses, even if it's already announced in chapter 4. I'm quoting, though the people may be ignorant, it is capable of truth. I popoli, benché siano ignoranti, sono capaci della verità. By the way, this sentence, in my opinion, is the condition of possibility of what Fabio Frosini yesterday indicates as the aim of the Discourses. That is, to make possible that the popolo could discuss the reason. In chapter 58, very famous, whose title is The Multitude is More Knowing, Savia, and More Constant Than Is a Prince, Machiavelli at first describes the main characteristics of the anti-popular ideology, culminating in the famous maxim from Livy, it is the nature of the multitude either servilely to obey or arrogantly to domineer. Haec natura multitudinis est, aut humiliter servit, aut superbe dominatur. But then he overturns this criticism by accusing the princes to hold the same vices of the multitude, even in much more dangerous form. And finally, he concludes that, I'm quoting, if it be a question of a prince subservient to the laws and of a people chained up by laws, more virtue will be found in the people than in the prince. And if it be a question of either of them loosed, sciolto, from the control by the law, there will be found fewer errors in the people than in the prince. End quotation. As it happens for the humor of the plebs, also the passions of the multitude must be regulated to avoid the danger that it becomes sciolta, because in such a condition, a popolo can hardly act in common, since he appears to be a disconnected amount of different individuals, or, in other terms, his action is at complete mercy of unreasonable forces, which push him to destroy everything and to become an easy prey of a tyrant. Once again, Machiavelli emphasized that laws and political institutions should define, that is, create a common frame, the behaviors of the multitude, in order to defeat personal ambitions and to improve the force of a collective affects towards mutual cooperation. Nevertheless, these institutions do not arise from a power external to the multitude itself, since the roots are deep in its body. Therefore, a free republic is also meant to build a space of common education, as also Fabio again and some other intervention will had insisted on this issue, in order to select and reinforce the passions which keep the multitude together while fighting those ones which disrupt it. Actually, the passions and the desires of the multitude cause the superiority of a republican constitution over a princely government because of its variety and its capacity to change together with the changing of times. I'm quoting from Discourses, 3rd book, chapter 9. A republic has a fuller life, maggiore vita, and enjoys good fortune for a longer time than a principality, since it's better able to adapt itself to diverse circumstances, alla diversità dei temporali, owing to the diversity found among its citizens, per la diversità dei cittadini, than a prince can do. Thus, the face of people as multitude expresses the political primacy of multiplicity over unity, although we cannot consider these two principles as necessarily opposed to each other. Rather, the authority can be held by a single man too, insofar as he is strictly controlled by public laws and institutions, that is, by the power of the many. Anyway, the building of a popular republic of the multitude is not an easy task, especially if the popolo is, quoting from Discourses, 1st book, chapter 16, accustomed to live under a prince, uso a vivere sotto un principe. Since in this case, I'm quoting again, should he by some eventuality becomes free, will with difficulty maintain his freedom. Here Machiavelli introduces the imagine, kind of a reversed copy of the multitude Savian costante, of a popolo as a wild animal, animale bruto, brought up in captivity and servitude, whose desire not to be dominated seems replaced by a habit to live as a slave. Even more, it is the multitude itself who places the yoke on its neck. First book, chapter 17. Ella non conobbe il gioco che da sé medesima si metteva in sul collo. Seeking, quoting again from the chapter 53, its own ruin, in a kind of voluntary servitude. Nonetheless, Machiavelli, in Discourses, first book, chapter 44, declares in an apparent self-contradiction that, quoting, a multitude is useless without a head. End of quotation. And this very problematic statement brings us to a new phase of the popolo, perhaps the most paradoxical one. This is a popolo which expresses himself, which finds a connection by means of the new prince, who assumes the role to reorganize, or better to refound, the political community. It must be noted that Machiavelli does not confer any representative value, neither from a juridical nor from an existential point of view, to the princely power. Rather, even if the prince comes from outside the body of the popolo, the new prince must create a set of relationships in different ways and with different gradation of intensity with the emotional and imaginative horizon of the popolo, in a restless dialectic with him. For instance, the history of Cesare Borgia reveals that he tries to establish his authority over his new subjects following a twofold strategy. On the one side, the use of an unhesitatingly violence, entirely concentrated on its purpose. On the other side, but Yves Winter has shown that these two operations are strictly connected, a communicative skill that cannot be reduced neither to a manipulation of the effects of the popolo, nor to a creation of a regime of fear. In fact, the prince's virtue coincides with the effectiveness of his acts, lacking in any a priori guarantee, since the eyes of the subjects are all turned to him. As Machiavelli writes, quoting from chapter 15 of The Prince, all men, when they are spoken about, and especially princes, because they are placed higher, per essere posti più alti, are noted, sono notati, for some of the following qualities, which bring them either blame or praise. End of quotation. So that they must be able to, quoting once again, to flee the infamy of those vices that take the state away from them. Since the prince is placed higher, as if he were the head of the collective body, he does not only observe everything from an external viewpoint, but he is also observed by everyone. The relation between him and his popolo cannot be reduced to a monodirectional intervention of the first or the latter. It is rather the encounter between the two, not only the exchange of their gazes, but overall the emotions these gazes cause in each other, that generates a change in the political constitution of the city. The new prince must be able to continuously adapt his own behavior in order to satisfy, from time to time, the necessity, I'm quoting from different chapters, 16, 17, 19, to retain among men the name of a liberal man, nome di liberale, to be believed, essere tenuto, compassionate and not cruel, to avoid those things that could make him hateful and contemptible, che lo faccino odioso e contennendo. A good example of such bidirectional relationship is offered by the passion of fear. Actually, if sometimes a prince can usefully frighten his subjects, nevertheless, he must also pay attention not to become their enemy, since, quoting from chapter 19, a prince must have two fears, one inside on account of his subjects, the other outside on account of external powers. But as to his subjects, if external things are not in motion, he has to fear that they may conspire secretly, against which the prince secures himself very well if he avoids being hated and despised and keeps the people satisfied with him, tenendosi il popolo satisfatto di lui. Satisfatto e stupido. But this is in the story of Cesare Borgia killing Ramiro de Lorca, which is an example, an ambivalent example somehow. No, never mind. To assure his own position, the new prince must act so, quoting from chapter 16, now Discourses, first book, chapter 16, excuse me, to make the people his friend. His security necessarily depends on that of the popolo, and vice versa, in a fragile but at the same time unsurmountable connection. This is why, when he discusses about the civil principality, in chapter 9, Machiavelli exhorts the prince, I'm quoting, with his spirit and his orders, to keep the universality inspired, tenere animato l'universale, so that he will never find himself deceived by the people, and he will judge that he has built good foundation. End quotation. To keep the universality animato means neither to supply us with a soul, someone who is lacking in it, nor to give life to an inert body. It rather means, in my interpretation, to reactivate the virtue as a chemical reagent, as a kind of catalyzer, you say, letting the good passions and imagination circulate within the body of the popolo. But there is another form of corruption which can affect the popolo, and it concerns the last figure I will take into account. That is a figure of the popolo internally divided, as it has been described in the history of Florence. The history of this city testifies to the risk of a transformation of the humor of the popolo in sectarianism, when political institutions do not succeed in constructing a frame to bound the strength of ambitions. I'm quoting from Book 7, Chapter 1. The dissensions, the inimicizie of Florence were always accompanied by factions, sette, and were therefore always pernicious. And the dominant party, setta vincitrice, only remained united so long as its enemies held it in check. As soon as the strength of the opposition was annihilated, the government, deprived of a restraining influence of its adversary, non avendo più paura, and being subject to no law, fell to pieces. End of quotation. It has been often noted that the material condition of modern Florence is quite different from that of ancient Rome. The people of Florence is directly involved in the development of the commercial and economical growth of the city, especially the so-called higher people, popolo grasso. Therefore, the passion of ambition, together with its political equivalent, that is the insolence, flows through the entire body of the city. This is why, I'm quoting from the Proemio, from the preface of History of Florence, if in any other republic there were ever notable divisions, those of Florence are most notable. For most other republics about which we have any information have been content with one division, but Florence, not content with one, made many. And then again, in Florence, the nobles were first divided among themselves, then the nobles and the people, and then, in the end, the noble and the plebs. A few minutes. 10 is too much. Yeah, okay. The division between the popolo grasso and the popolo minuto, which is the main topic of the third book of the history, is caused by the different outcome compared with Rome of the struggle between the nobles and the popolo. Whereas the Roman laws and institutions were able to transform this conflict into positive energy, which maintains the city free, in Florence, because of, I'm quoting, the defective nature of her laws, i non buoni ordini suoi, the desire of the people soon became, I'm quoting again, insolent and unjust, since it strove to exclude the nobility from all participation in the government of the city. This is from chapter 1 of the third book. The conclusion is quite apparent. I'm quoting from chapter 5. In a city that is governed by sects rather than by laws, as soon as one becomes dominant and unopposed, it must be of necessity soon divides against itself. In other words, since the popolo, and especially the popolo grasso, assumes the humor of the nobles, that is the desire to command and to oppress, he needs to separate from himself a part which must be commanded and oppressed, the popolo minuto. Thus, the attempt to unify the city under a unique absolute authority causes the creation of a new division within it, since the division of the city could never be overcome, but only governed by just laws. In the history of Florence, Machiavelli clearly demonstrates what in the previous works was only implicit. Il popolo does not possess any anthropological or ethical superiority compared to the nobles. There is no reason to consider the popolo as intrinsically good or just, as if he were moved to fight for freedom by a moral imperative. On the contrary, it is the existence of a political and hierarchical division within the space of the city that allows the popolo, or any part which occupies the lower level, under determinate conditions, to act as the defenders of everyone's freedom. This is why, I'm quoting from the 7th book of chapter 1 of History of Florence. This is why those who think, well, in fact this is Sperano, who have the hope, a republic might be kept in perfect unity of purpose, are greatly deceived. Di questa speranza si ingannano. True it is that some divisions injure republics, while others are beneficial to them. When accompanied by factions and sects, they are injurious. But when maintained without them, they contribute to their prosperity. The legislator of a republic, since it is impossible to prevent the existence of dissensions, must at least take care to prevent the growth of sette, of faction, che non vi siano sette. End of quotation. The politics is thus coincident with the impossibility of a stable unity. There is no politics but the breaking of the spatial uniformity within the community. And any attempt to build a new unity by means of the neutralization of the struggles causes just a new division. The only possible union is the paradoxical cohabitation, deeply rooted on the institution of non-dominion, of two opposite desires, by means of which the division becomes productive. In any case, the desire not to be dominated and to live free is not a natural one, not even for the popolo. And Machiavelli repeatedly emphasized, I'm quoting now from History of Florence, 3rd book, chapter 27, how dangerous a thing is to attempt to set the people free who are resolved to be slave, che voglia in ogni modo essere servo. The struggle for freedom is the result of a complex interrelation between humors and laws, desires and institutions, tendency to unification and preservation of a spatial distance between the parts of the city. Such a process always follows different paths, depending on the historical conjuncture, which demands from time to time the emergence of a determined figure of the popolo and his unstable hegemony. So Machiavelli transforms the classical issue of the different forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, into the analysis of the specific historical and political conditions under which the popolo acquires a determinate phase, thus assuming the structural unsteadiness of every government. Nonetheless, if on the one side this unsteadiness is the fate of every political order, on the other side it's also a clear sign of the vitality of the popolo, since, as the Discourse's 3rd book, chapter 1 points out, quoting, those republics are better constituted and have a longer life, whose institution make frequent renovation possible. Si possono spesso rinnovare. End of quotation. The continuous renovation of political institutions shows the partial autonomy of the power of the popolo, that is, his strengths and his limits simultaneously, or better said, his strength as a limit, as a self-determination. Moreover, the polymorphous nature of the popolo, his fluid and magmatic character continuously reshapes the spatial coordinates which determinates the frame of political actions. The political space is always modified by the emergence of new figures and by the relationship they establish with the pre-existent collective actors. If the division and the distance among these subjects is not maintained through the right laws, any reductio ad unum, reduction to unity, that is, any construction of a uniform and pacified space, is at risk to be overturned into a Bayesian state of war. In conclusion, Machiavelli highlights that the political discourse is repeatedly decomposed and composed once again by the eruption of the historical contingency, so that the political order always emerges from an unsettled time and an undetermined space, both unitary and plural, united and divided, closed and expansive. The transformation of the different forms of government into the condition of visibility of the popolo testifies to the strategical nature of Machiavelli's thought, that is, to the profound connection between his political topography, never reducible to a transparent scientific theory, and his struggle for freedom. It is maybe one of the decisive aspects of Machiavellian modernity, still so difficult to recognize and so hard to accept. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 5 minutes, only five short minutes. So please keep the questions very short and focused. What? Yes, John.
Yeah, marvelous. Thank you for very impressive. I'll try to keep it short. I would just challenge your claim that the Florentine histories show that Machiavelli doesn't maintain his moral assessment of the people. I would just have you look at the end of Book 2, before the assessment at the beginning of Book 3, where he says the people wanted to exclude the nobles and that this was unjust. At the very end of Book 2, after the Duke of Athens is expelled, the people expand the signoria to allow the nobles to take office with them, and then the nobles no longer want the people in the signoria and take to the streets and take arms. So there's a disconnect between Machiavelli's assessment at the beginning of Book 3 and the action he has just described. So that's about the nature of the popolo. About the nature of the plebe, he says the plebeians always rejoice in evil, as you know. But then during the Ciompi revolt, after the speech of the Ciompo, the Ciompians, they take hold of the city and they propose a constitutional arrangement where they, the majority, are still outvoted by the middle and the upper guildsmen. And so it shows that they don't want to dominate, they want to be included. They want to not be oppressed, they don't want to oppress. So I think those are two examples that Machiavelli gives to show that his assessment of, or a change in assessment of the people is not true.
Okay, thank you, John. In the previous writing, I had also some part on the discourse of the Ciompo, but and I agree with you. But what I want to highlight, to emphasize, was just this: that there is no natural desire. I mean, like moral or natural superiority of it. So that's when this part of the popolo, which is the popolo grasso, is in power. He is always at risk, and this is what happens, to assume the ambition and the insolence of the powerful. So that's what I call the political topography. It depends on the space you occupy, and not on the desire as a kind of permanent and unchangeable nature that you have. That's anyway, of course. That's why the popolo minuto, which is subaltern, keeps maintaining a desire not to be dominated.
One of the things that I find most interesting in your quite remarkable presentation, not the only one, but one of the things, is the latent comparison between Machiavelli and Spinoza, which is not surprising coming from you. And so my question would be the following. What you show convincingly is that in Machiavelli, and that would be the case also, of course, for Spinoza, there's an economy of passions that is underlying the epistemological problem, I mean, the reflection on knowing and recognition among the different parts of the political body. Passions in both the social and the affective sense. But then, would you say what's striking with the latent comparison is that the passions involved in Machiavelli's scheme, as you describe it, are essentially the negative passions. I mean, it's an economy of fear, and hope is apparently absent from there. Therefore, a certain form of ambivalence, not only because. Because Machiavelli is extremely suspicious of the effects of hope in politics, or because he has a different understanding of the passions themselves. Is that relevant to your?
Well, in fact, when I study Machiavelli, I always try not to. I know that not to be too much influenced by my studies of Spinoza. In any case, it's for sure these. I think these two philosophers, even because Spinoza was a very attentive reader of Machiavelli, they share the same, I would say, attention to this economic of passions, but they put the accent on a different, and on this point, for sure, Machiavelli tends to emphasize more the political productive role of fear, and while, about hope, it's for sure, Machiavelli doesn't give too much. It's the negative affect. Those who hope for building a republic, as I quoted before, but while in Spinoza it's quite complicated, I think. But also in Spinoza, as of course Filippo demonstrates, that fear plays an important, even more limited role. For instance, in the aristocratic regime, where the freedom of the multitude is possible because they make fear to the aristocracy. So, yes, I think it's more a different of accent, but still there's a lot of links that probably has to be studied more in depth. Oh, thank you.
I'm afraid we have to stop. But you're welcome to